All right, let's dive in. I mean, who isn't at least a little bit fascinated by the mystery of the Turin shroud, right?
Oh, absolutely.
This linen cloth over 4 meters long.
It's amazing.
And on it, you have this image, a little bit faint, a little bit haunting, but it's clearly the image of a man
Yeah.
who looks like he's been through a lot, to put it mildly.
Yeah.
Crucifixion, scourging, piercing. I mean, it matches up.
It's brutal. Yeah.
It matches up with the biblical account of the crucifixion in a way that honestly sends chills down my spine.
I know.
And so then the age-old question, is this thing really from the 1st century AD?
Right.
Or is it some kind of medieval fake?
A medieval forgery.
It's wild.
Yeah. And it's a question that's been debated for so long, both scientifically and just among the public. It's one of those things that captures everyone's imagination.
Totally. And that's exactly what we're going to look at today. We're going to do a deep dive, really unpack this enduring mystery. And, specifically today, we're going to be looking at an article you sent over.
That's right.
Which is all about a new way of dating the shroud.
Yeah, it's really fascinating. It was published in 2022 in the journal Heritage.
Okay.
And the title is X-ray Dating of a Turin Shroud's Linen Sample. So it's all about this, like I said, new way of trying to figure out the age of the shroud's linen, which I think is super cool.
That's what we're going to break down today. This new X-ray dating technique, how it works, what it tells us about the shroud,
Yeah.
and, where this new evidence kind of fits into the bigger picture of the ongoing debate about the shroud's authenticity.
Exactly.
And look, we're going to try to cut through all the, complex scientific jargon, get straight to the heart of what you need to know.
Yeah, make it understandable and interesting.
But, before we jump into this new X-ray stuff, we have to at least mention the big elephant in the room.
Right.
The study that, has just dominated this whole conversation for decades.
Yeah.
And that's the 1988 radiocarbon dating, right?
Exactly.
Which, back then concluded that the shroud was actually from around 1325 AD.
Give or take 65 years.
Yeah.
So that really firmly put it in the medieval period.
Right. That's a big deal. I mean, for a lot of people, that seemed like that's it.
The final word.
The final word. Case closed.
Yeah, absolutely.
But over time, there have been, some questions raised about that 1988 dating. It hasn't aged as well as some other things.
No. It's faced a lot of criticism, and I think deservedly so. There were initial concerns about things like, contamination of the samples, the way they were handled. But here's what's really fascinating. So after almost 30 years,
Wow.
and even a legal battle, they finally released the raw data from that 1988 study.
Wow.
And that was huge. And, when researchers finally got to dig into that raw data, their subsequent statistical analysis really did back up a lot of those earlier concerns.
Yeah. Okay, so what did the raw data actually reveal? What were some of the biggest warning signs?
Well, one of the main issues was the consistency or lack thereof in the carbon dating results from the different samples they took from the shroud. If you're measuring the same thing, you would expect the results to be pretty close. But in this case, there was a surprising amount of variation. It's what we call statistical heterogeneity. And it basically means things weren't adding up as neatly as they should have.
And what about the locations of those samples on the shroud? Did any concerns come up about that?
Yes, absolutely. There were questions about whether the specific spots they took those samples from were really representative of the entire cloth. Was it possible that they were inadvertently sampling from areas that might have been more prone to contamination, or maybe had undergone repairs or something like that?
Right. Because I remember reading that contamination was a major, major concern with that study. Why is that such a crucial point when we're talking about radiocarbon dating?
Well, imagine this. The shroud has existed for centuries. In that time, it's been handled by countless people. It's probably been exposed to smoke from fires, maybe even had contact with, little bits of organic material like dust or insects. All of those things can introduce newer carbon into the linen fibers. And when you're trying to date something using radiocarbon, any newer carbon can throw off the results and make the object appear younger than it actually is.
So it sounds like that 1988 radiocarbon dating might not be the definitive answer it was once thought to be.
I think that's fair to say.
And this new X-ray research isn't the first to suggest that the shroud might be older than the Middle Ages, is it?
That's right. There have been quite a few other scientific studies that have hinted at a much earlier origin for the shroud. The article you shared actually mentioned several.
Oh, interesting. Like what?
Well, for example, there are these methods called Fourier transform infrared and Raman spectroscopy. Basically, they analyze how light interacts with the linen And they've suggested dates ranging anywhere from around 300 BC to about 500 AD, depending on the study.
Okay, so that's a pretty broad range, but it definitely pushes it way back before the 14th century.
Right. And then there's this other analysis that focused on the physical properties of the linen itself. It's called a mechanical multi-parametric method, and it estimated the shroud to be around 400 AD, plus or minus 400 years.
Wow. So they're all over the place, but they all seem to think it's older than that 1988 dating.
Exactly. And there are even more. There was one study that looked at the rate at which vanillin, which is a compound found in lignin, and lignin is present in flax, the plant linen is made from. It looked at how quickly that vanillin breaks down over time.
Okay, so that sounds pretty complex.
It is, but what's interesting is that study suggested a really wide age range. The shroud, somewhere between 1,300 and 3,000 years old.
Whoa, that's a huge gap.
Yeah, it is. And more recently, there was even a numismatic analysis, which is the study of ancient coins.
Okay.
And they proposed that the shroud might have been around as early as 692 AD, based on how it might be depicted on some coins. Yeah. So you can see there's a growing body of evidence that's suggesting the shroud might be considerably older than that 1988 radiocarbon date indicated.
Okay, so we've got this backdrop of alternative dating methods, many of which point to an older shroud.
Right.
Now let's dig into the star of today's show, this new X-ray dating method. What's the basic concept here?
Well, the method is called wide-angle X-ray scattering, or WACXS for short.
Catchy.
And it basically works by looking at how the structure of ancient linen threads breaks down over time.
Okay.
Linen is made up primarily of cellulose, and over time, that cellulose naturally degrades.
So it's like the older it gets, the more it breaks down.
Exactly. And this WXS method uses X-rays to examine the way molecules are arranged within those cellulose fibers. They're looking for very subtle changes that occur as the linen ages and those molecules start to break apart.
And this is something they've used on other old fabrics before trying it on the Turin shroud, right?
That's right. They've actually tested this WXS technique on other ancient linens that had already been dated using radiocarbon methods.
Okay. And what's really important here is that they specifically chose linens found in sealed tombs.
Oh, I see. So they could be pretty confident about the ages of those fabrics.
Exactly. Because in a tomb, the chances of contamination from the environment are much, much lower.
Right.
And the cool thing is that in those cases where they had that confidence, the age estimates from the X-ray dating lined up pretty well with the radiocarbon results.
Okay, so that gives them more reason to trust this method when they apply it to something like the shroud.
Exactly. It provides that extra level of confidence.
All right, so they know this WASS method seems to work. How did they actually go about using it on the Turin shroud?
Well, they started by taking a very, very small sample from the shroud. I'm talking about a tiny thread, only about 0.5 millimeter by 1 millimeter in size.
Wow, that's tiny.
It is. And they took this minuscule sample from an area near where one of the samples for the 1988 radiocarbon dating was obtained.
So it's from a comparable spot on the cloth, yet from the corner of the shroud that would correspond to the feet of the image on the front, near what's known as the raised sample.
Okay, so they've got their tiny sample. What do they do with it?
Well, then it's time for the WACS process. They basically shoot a beam of X-rays at the linen sample.
Okay.
And these X-rays then bounce off the cellulose molecules within the fibers and scatter in different directions.
Ah, so it's kind of like they're creating a sort of X-ray fingerprint of the linen's structure.
That's a great way to put it. And by carefully analyzing the pattern of that scattered X radiation, scientists can actually measure the level of degradation in the cellulose.
So how do they interpret that pattern? How do they know what a 2,000-year-old linen should look like under X-ray scattering compared to, say, a 700-year-old one?
Well, they need something to compare it to, right? So in this case, they compared the X-ray scattering pattern they got from the shroud with measurements from a linen sample with a really well-established age linen from the siege of Masada in Israel, which dates back to between 55 and 74 AD.
Ah, so they have a known reference point from ancient times.
Exactly. And what they found is that the X-ray scattering patterns from the Turin shroud sample and this first-century Masada linen were actually qualitatively similar. It's like seeing similar signs of wear and tear on two pieces of antique furniture, for example.
That's really intriguing, but there's also this detail in the paper about them having to adjust the intensity of the X-rays because their instrument had changed over time. Can you explain what that was all about?
Yes, good catch. So the thing is, they took the measurements on the Turin shroud sample a while after they'd done the initial setup and measurements on their other reference samples. And in the meantime, they had to do some routine maintenance on their X-ray instrument, They replaced a part, realigned some optics, things like that. And those changes, even though they were necessary, could potentially affect the strength of the X-ray beam.
So it's like their measuring stick had slightly changed?
Exactly. So to make sure they were comparing apples to apples, they remeasured a standard reference sample, a new bleached Italian fabric they called Sample A, just to establish a consistent baseline for all their measurements.
So it's like recalibrating a scale after you move it, just to make sure it's still accurate.
Exactly. It's all about ensuring those measurements are as reliable as possible.
Okay, so now they have a way to accurately compare their X-ray data. Now they introduced this concept called the aging parameter, or AP. What is that, and why is it so important?
So the aging parameter, or AP, is basically a scientific way to quantify how much the cellulose in the linen has broken down over time.
Okay.
It's a ratio that looks at the current number of breaks in those long chains of cellulose molecules.
So it's a way to say how old, in a sense, the linen is based on how much its structure has deteriorated.
Exactly. And they have a specific term for those breaks in the cellulose chains. They call them chain breaks, or CB. So the AP is a ratio that compares the current number of chain breaks to the maximum number that could possibly occur if the linen were to completely degrade over a really, really long time.
Okay, so it's like a measure of how far along the linen is on its journey to total breakdown.
Exactly. And based on their analysis of the Turin shroud sample, they calculated an AP value of 0.60 plus or minus 0.02,
Okay.
which is pretty high. And this means that a significant amount of cellulose degradation has already occurred in the shroud's linen. It's like saying the aging clock for this linen is quite far along.
Right. So they have this AP value. How do they translate that number into an estimated age in years? I mean, how do they go from a 0.60 AP to saying, oh, this shroud is probably X number of centuries old?
Well, to do that, they have to bring in a lot more scientific modeling. They have to consider all the factors that contribute to the natural breakdown of cellulose. Things like the activation energy required to break those chemical bonds in cellulose, the maximum potential for that breakdown to occur, and, really crucially, the environmental conditions the linen has experienced over the centuries.
Ah, so things like the temperature and humidity it's been stored in.
Exactly. The hotter and more humid the environment, the faster that breakdown process will happen.
Makes sense. So they're basically trying to create a model that takes into account both the inherent properties of the linen and the environment it's lived in.
Precisely. They actually provide all the specific scientific values they used in their calculations, but what they emphasize is that while humidity does play a role, they estimate that increasing the humidity by 10% within a certain range can speed up degradation by about 10%. The average temperature over long periods has a much, much stronger effect.
So the temperature really drives the process.
Yes, and that's because temperature affects chemical reactions exponentially. It's like the difference between simmering something on the stove and cranking up the heat to boil it rapidly.
Right, the temperature makes a huge difference in how fast things happen. Now, it's here that their findings really start to clash with that 1988 radiocarbon dating, right?
Yes, this is where things get interesting. They looked at the known history of the shroud over the last 7 centuries. We know it was in France for about 200 years and then in Turin, Italy for the 5 centuries after that. And they have data on the average temperatures and humidity levels for Turin around 12.5 degrees Celsius and 75% humidity. And they also know that the average temperature across Europe during that time was even cooler, somewhere between 8.5 and 9 degrees Celsius.
And given those relatively cool and, in Turin's case, moderately humid conditions over those 7 centuries, what kind of AP value would they expect to see?
Their calculations show that even if we assume the shroud experienced the warmer Turin conditions for the entire 7 centuries, the AP value would still only be around 0.027, which is tiny, almost negligible, and it's massively lower than the 0.60 they actually measured for the shroud. So this leads them to a pretty strong conclusion. The 14C dating, which puts the shroud at around 7 centuries old, just doesn't match up with their X-ray dating results, especially when we consider what we know about the shroud's history in Europe.
Okay, so if the shroud isn't around 7 centuries old based on their X-ray dating, how old do they think it might be?
Well, to reach that measured AP value of 0.60, the shroud must have spent many more centuries in a different environment, one that would have accelerated that cellulose breakdown.
So somewhere hotter and perhaps more humid.
Exactly. Their calculations suggest that if, before it came to Europe, the shroud spent roughly 13 centuries in an environment with an average temperature of about 22.5 degrees Celsius and average humidity around 55%, then its total age would be somewhere in the ballpark of 20.2 centuries, give or take about zero point 0.8 centuries.
Wow, so potentially dating back to Roman times.
Right. But they also point out that those are just average values. And different temperature scenarios during those earlier centuries could shift that age estimate a bit.
Oh, so if it was cooler during those unknown centuries, the shroud would have to be even older.
That's right. If the average temperatures during those 13 centuries were any lower than 22 degrees Celsius, the shroud would need even more time to reach that level of degradation. So it would have to be even older. On the flip side, if those temperatures were consistently higher, above 23 degrees, the estimated age could be a bit younger than 20 centuries, but still significantly older than the 7 centuries suggested by the carbon dating.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, to really test the limits of this idea, they even looked at an extreme scenario using the climate of Mali, one of the hottest places on Earth, as their model. What did they find when they did that?
Even when they modeled the most extreme degradation conditions over 7 centuries, imagining the shroud was kept somewhere incredibly hot and dry like Mali, they still couldn't reach the measured AP value for the shroud.
So that pretty much rules out the idea of it being a recent artifact, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's strong evidence against a recent origin. They point out that for the shroud to be much younger than 20 centuries, it would have had to be kept in extremely hot regions consistently before coming to Europe. And they think that's pretty unlikely given how much cooler Europe has been over the last 7 centuries.
Right. Now, there's another important factor we need to consider here, and that's fire. We know that the Turin Shroud has a history of being involved in fires. Did they look into whether those events could have skewed their dating results?
They absolutely did. They actually ran experiments where they exposed linen samples to a really high temperature, 200 degrees Celsius, for 30 minutes.
Wow, that's like oven temperature.
Right. And they did this to simulate the kind of heat shock the shroud would have experienced in a fire. What they observed was fascinating. The heat caused significant yellowing of the linen, which is consistent with historical accounts of fire damage to the shroud. But what's interesting is that this intense heat didn't seem to change the WAXS patterns.
So it changed how the linen looked, but not how much its cellulose had degraded.
Exactly. And they explained that this is probably because during a fire, the relative humidity plummets, and that drastically slows down the rate of cellulose degradation. So even though the shroud went through these brief periods of intense heat, it wouldn't have had a huge impact on the long-term aging process they're tracking with this method.
So those fires might have affected the appearance of the shroud, but not necessarily its fundamental age as determined by the WXS method.
Precisely. They even point out that exposure to that kind of heat, even for a short time, could have darkened or even erased the image on the shroud because of that yellowing effect. But again, that's a separate process from the slow natural breakdown of those linen fibers over centuries.
Okay, so they've accounted for the potential impact of fires. So what's the bottom line here? What does this study conclude about the age of the Turin Shroud?
Their main conclusion, and they're pretty clear about this, is that based on their WACREC-S analysis, it's highly probable that the Turin Shroud is around 20 centuries old. And they explicitly state that this finding contradicts the 1988 radiocarbon dating and any other estimations that put it in the medieval period. It's a pretty bold statement.
So they're basically saying this X-ray dating points to a shroud from Roman times, not Middle Ages. Do they see this as the final word, or do they think more research is needed?
They do acknowledge that further investigation is warranted. They specifically say that it would be good to do X-ray analysis on more samples from the shroud to confirm their findings, but they also highlight some advantages of this WXS method.
Okay, like what?
Well, for one thing, it only requires incredibly tiny samples, like that half-millimeter thread they used, and you can actually take repeated measurements on the same sample without damaging it.
Oh, that's good. Less invasive.
Exactly. And they also point out that it's easier to do blinded studies using WXS because those tiny threads are pretty much indistinguishable from one another. Unlike in the 1988 carbon dating, where they used larger samples and the unique weave of the shroud was actually recognizable, which could have introduced bias. People maybe subconsciously wanting to get a certain result.
Oh, that's a great point. The potential for bias is always something to consider. So, if they're right and the shroud is indeed around 20 centuries old, what does that tell us about its history before it showed up in Europe?
Well, remember they said that for the shroud to have reached that level of degradation, it would have needed to spend roughly 13 centuries before its documented presence in Europe in an environment with specific average temperatures and humidity levels.
Right, somewhere between 20 and 22.5 degrees Celsius and 55 to 75% humidity.
Exactly. So think about that. Those are pretty specific constraints. They suggest that this scientific data might actually help historians narrow down potential locations and time periods for the shroud's pre-European existence.
Mhm.
Like they could look for regions that fit that climate profile and see if there are any historical connections.
That's such a cool idea, using the science of material degradation to potentially solve historical
I
mysteries.
know, it's fascinating.
And finally, do they say anything about why the image on the shroud has survived if it's really that old? I mean, wouldn't you expect it to have faded away completely after so many centuries?
They do offer an interesting thought about that. They propose that it might have been fortunate that the shroud was brought to Europe about 7 centuries ago. Because Europe is relatively cool, those cooler temperatures probably slowed down the degradation process of the cellulose. And that might be why the image hasn't completely faded away. If it had stayed in a warmer climate, that degradation could have been much more advanced and the image might have been lost. It's like the shroud has its own silent story to tell, written in the way its fibers have aged over time, a record of the climates it's endured.
So maybe being moved to Europe was a bit of a lucky break for the shroud, at least in terms of preserving that image.
Yeah, quite possibly.
Okay, so let's wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating new research. The key takeaway here is that this X-ray dating analysis provides pretty compelling evidence that the Turin shroud's linen is likely around 20 centuries old, which, if true, totally upends the more recent medieval dating from the 1988 radiocarbon study. It's incredible to think that the material science of a simple piece of linen could potentially rewrite such a significant part of history.
Absolutely. And I think this new evidence raises a really profound question. What does this potentially ancient age tell us about the history and the journey of this incredibly mysterious artifact?
Right.
Think about all the historical possibilities, all the different geographical locations the shroud might have traveled through during those 13 undocumented centuries to match those specific temperature and humidity conditions. It's mind-blowing.
I know. And on that note, to our listeners, if you're as captivated by this whole thing as we are, we really encourage you to check out the original research paper
Yeah, do some digging.
and look into other studies on the Turin Shroud. Understanding the science behind it all gives you a whole new way to approach these historical mysteries. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll see you next time.
See you then.